These were the absolute worst jobs in World War II. Number 10. One of the most dangerous places to be in any war is being trapped inside of a steel tube deep underwater. Submarines were a key part of ocean warfare, especially in the Atlantic. German U-boats and Allied submarines were packed with soldiers trying to work some of the most complicated technology ever seen on the battlefield. And these underwater tin cans were death traps waiting to happen. A slight mistake sealing the porthole could mean drowning. A gas leak or sudden pressure change would mean horrific decompression. And a direct hit from the enemy ship would doom the entire crew to a watery grave. Rescue was almost impossible due to the depths. Escaping the underwater coffin and then getting to the surface was a long shot, and the casualty rates were horrific. From the roughly 16,000 Americans who served aboard submarines, 25% did not come home. An additional 30,000 submariners from the Allies also sank to a watery grave. But that is nothing compared to the enemy. There were an estimated 41,000 German soldiers aboard U-boats during the war, and it's estimated that around 28,000 of them died. For the majority of submariners, it wasn't just a job, it was a death sentence. If dying underwater felt unavoidable, some World War II pilots faced the same odds, just not how you would expect. Number 9. One of the most critical battlefields of the early war was the Chinese front. Japan had invaded China before the larger war began, instituting a brutal occupation that wound up killing millions. The Chinese resistance pushed the occupation to its limit. However, the Japanese occupation in the region had a devastating effect, cutting off many supply routes and leaving Chinese forces struggling for even basic weapons. So the Allies stepped in, and that came with a great cost. The Hump was the nickname given to the eastern end of the Himalayan mountains, which provided a key route from British-occupied India to China. Military transport aircraft would be sent over this critical region, despite the United States Air Force not being trained to operate in this region. The high altitude made communicating with bases extremely difficult, and getting reliable information about the weather was tricky. There weren't even detailed charts for how to navigate the mission, making this pretty close to a one-way mission for many of the pilots who took it. Fully loaded planes couldn't clear all the mountains, meaning they had to weave through the peaks, and the intense turbulence could send a plane plummeting in seconds. But the pilots still had to make the trip. For more than 3 years, thousands of tons of supplies were flown into occupied China, allowing the resistance to take the fight to the Japanese forces. But over 700 Allied planes would crash during this operation, with 1,200 airmen paying the price. That meant that the people who took the mission had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. But there was an impressive reward. 1.5 million Japanese troops were tied up in this ongoing battle, providing much-needed breathing room in the Pacific theater. And the worst part? You didn't have to be a soldier to die at those rates. Sometimes all you had to do was deliver the supplies. Number 8. The United States merchant mariners ran a gauntlet on a daily basis. Their supply runs kept soldiers in the European theater stocked with weapons, gear, and other essentials. And to get from the United States to war-torn Europe, the mariners would take on the North Atlantic Ocean route, an area swarming with U-boats. And they made no distinction between a military vessel and a civilian one. The open seas were dangerous, but as they approached the Mediterranean Sea or the English Channel, it became a gamble, and the odds were stacked against them. 1 out of every 26 merchant mariners died in the war, a percentage of 3.85%. That was even higher than the Marines, and proportionally the deadliest of any service branch. The Merchant Marine's most lethal stretch, the Murmansk Run, took place in the North Atlantic, and it was critical to supplying Soviet-controlled ports. The Merchant Marines suffered high losses, but they were denied military benefits after the war as they were technically civilians. It would be decades before they got their proper acknowledgments. But while these men died trying to reach the battlefield, others were ordered to fly straight into it over and over again. Number 7. World War II changed warfare. The skies were now critical to the outcome of all the military theaters. Warring parties could strike at their enemy halfway around the world, something the United States found out the hard way at Pearl Harbor. And for the men aboard the planes, death was a constant specter. The United States and the United Kingdom played an important role in the air, in both Europe and over the Pacific. The US dropped the most bombs during the invasion of Europe after D-Day, and the UK actually engaged in the longest continuous bombing of Nazi forces. High-speed aerial combat operations meant that hundreds of pilots being shot down every day was an inevitability, and very few were able to parachute to safety and avoid capture. No matter which Air Force you were in, the chances of dying were very high. While a tour of duty for a U.S. airman was 25 missions, the average pilot only made it to 15. In the first year of combat, one unit saw only 30% of its members survive their missions. The British had it even worse, with over half of the pilots in the RAF bomber crew dying in combat. Another 12% died outside of combat. It's estimated that they got the better end of the deal, though. Well over half of the German pilots died in combat, around 12,000 in total. And even if you survived the sky, the war had another way to kill you: quietly, anonymously, and alone. Number 6. While military forces carried the lion's share of wartime deaths, much of the war effort depended on agents on the ground, the people moving critical information and supplies back and forth. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, was a British organization founded in 1940 to conduct espionage across Nazi-occupied Europe. They would collect intel and communicate it back to handlers in Great Britain. This meant that every single SOE agent was a target. The organization employed over 13,000 people during the war, and approximately 25% of them were women. One of the most dangerous aspects of the operation was being burned behind enemy lines, often unarmed with no backup. Escape was unlikely, and even if they evaded Nazi soldiers at first, they still had to cross occupied France into a neutral country. And this took its toll. It's estimated that among the total population of SOE operators, about 1 in 4 died during the mission. Shockingly, that number was much higher for female operators, with almost 50% of them never making it out. The majority were either killed in action while trying to escape or immediately executed once their operations were discovered. Some operatives were taken to a concentration camp by the Nazis, where death was almost inevitable. And in many cases, their fate wasn't known until after the war. They simply disappeared without a trace. But at least these agents chose the risk. Others were killed simply for trying to save the men beside them. Number 5. Combat medics work under incredibly intense conditions. Specially trained soldiers, they're responsible for providing emergency care in the middle of battle, stabilizing the wounded and keeping them alive long enough to be evacuated for surgery. And that means racing into the line of fire. Combat medics had one of the highest rates of casualties among U.S. Army roles during the war, with almost 2,300 reportedly being killed in combat and over 13,000 being injured. The Navy lost almost 900 doctors of their own during the war. This high rate of death is likely due to the necessity of slowing down to rescue their fellow men, putting them at a high risk of being picked off by enemy fire. And the reward for a successful escape was to do it all again, because the combat medic is needed in every battle. That is, until their luck runs out. Some jobs risked death by trying to prevent it. Others were built around the assumption that you wouldn't come back. Number 4. We already know that submarines were one of the biggest death traps during World War II, and nothing terrified a crew more than torpedoes. They could easily rip a hole in the hull of a Navy vessel and send it to the bottom of the ocean, taking hundreds of sailors with it. But torpedoes come with a problem: aiming. A missed shot could alert an enemy ship of the submarine's position and return fire. So to solve the problem, armies relied on good old human ingenuity. Navies came up with their own attempts at human-piloted torpedoes, most of which weren't very good, and they came with a high risk of death. It usually involved one unfortunate sailor who was placed in a capsule on top of a torpedo. The sailor would steer it within range of the target, then release the torpedo, but getting away was tricky. Many were caught in the explosion or failed to release it in time. Either way, the sailor was doomed, with an estimated 60% or more of men given this duty meeting their end. But the Japanese decided to cut out the middleman. The Kaiten was a crude torpedo that made its debut in the last days of World War II, with a single pilot operating it, although larger models were designed for a crew of up to 5 people. The operation was simple. The ship would be steered into the enemy vessels and deliver a powerful explosive payload, with no way for the pilot to exit. This was a one-way trip, making it one of the rare jobs in World War II with a 100% fatality rate for those given the task, and it was rarely optional. And sometimes the deadliest job wasn't heroic or dramatic, it was just being visible for too long. Number 3. One of the most important things in the fog of war is the ability to communicate. An ambush around the corner or a sudden change in weather conditions could ruin an entire mission. That meant military forces relied heavily on field telephones, manually laid using wire and antennas in the middle of the battlefield. And someone had to lay that wire. This was one of the most harrowing jobs imaginable, usually performed by irregular infantrymen. They would carry a large spool of wire on their back, running or crawling through enemy territory and laying the wire down as they went. They would connect it to the antenna and test the communication as they finished. This came with plenty of risks, including the fact that they usually couldn't use a weapon effectively while weighed down with the wire. and they were easy targets for snipers while crawling along their route, and that left a terrible toll. Those assigned to field telephone duty were usually either laying wire or carrying a large field radio so the commander could send messages. Not only were they target practice for the enemy, but they were trained to look for these soldiers, hoping to cut off the unit's ability to communicate. While there are no exact numbers about how many people served in this role, as it was a role the average soldier could be swapped into, it's believed that around 50% of those who had this deadly duty wound up perishing in the course of it. But there was one role where death wasn't a risk, it was the entire mission. Number 2. The Kamikaze role was only found in Imperial Japan. After the devastating attack at Pearl Harbor, it soon became clear the United States had the superior fleet, so Japan heavily shifted its efforts to try to sink U.S. battleships that dominated the Pacific, and their pilots were trained to bring them down at all costs, and that included their own lives. It's estimated that between 3,800 and 4,800 kamikaze pilots served in World War II, and they had one mission: target the enemy ships and fly directly into them to cause massive damage. There was no way to escape or survive. Those who took on this mission knew that they were sacrificing their lives for the glory of the Emperor. Imperial Japan prized loyalty to the leadership above all else, and almost invariably, they went to their doom. It's believed that up to 25% of kamikaze pilots survived their mission, either due to missions being scrubbed for weather or mechanical failures. This was usually seen as a disgrace for the pilot, and they would often be sent on the next available mission to redeem themselves. For a pilot to actually go AWOL on their mission to avoid dying was seen as the highest level of treason. It would mean death if captured and disgrace of their entire family. Every other pilot, around 3,800, died in their mission. Several dozen warships sank and over 7,000 Allied soldiers died. As for why so many Japanese soldiers were ready to take on this mission of no return, being an airman already had an extremely high risk of death to begin with. And nothing compares to a job where survival only meant waiting your turn. Number 1. While most of these jobs were carried out by soldiers or agents, Sonderkommando units were made up of prisoners. Their only crime was belonging to the wrong ethnic group. The lives of those deported to Nazi death camps, primarily Jews and Roma, along with the disabled and political prisoners, were entirely in the hands of brutal guards. Those deemed useful were used for slave labor, while those deemed too weak to work were often killed immediately. And that is where the darkest job of all came into play. The Sonderkommando unit were a unit of Nazi death camp prisoners who had the grim duty of entering the gas chamber after the latest wave of executions and disposing of the bodies. This involved manning the crematoriums as well as crushing the bones and collecting any remaining valuables. Due to the mass number of people killed at each death camp, a large staff of these prisoners was needed. At the death camp Birkenau, adjacent to Auschwitz, there were 400 prisoners working this role in 1943. When a mass number of Hungarian Jews were deported to the camps a year later, the staff more than doubled to 900 Sonderkommandos. It was mentally devastating work. They would be tasked with processing the bodies of their fellow prisoners, including sometimes their own family. And rejecting it was not an option. Most Sonderkommandos were recruited as soon as they arrived at the camp, a portion of the captives chosen for slave labor. They were invariably male, in good health, and able to work at backbreaking duty. To reject the duty was instant death, so most went along with it, hoping to prolong their life just a little longer. But while this was the most nightmarish duty imaginable for those assigned to it, it did come with some surprising benefits: better living quarters, more food, and less risk of summary execution by a sadistic guard. This was because the Sonderkommando were seen as the secret keepers of the camp. They knew too much, and it was important to keep them working quietly, at least for as long as they were needed. The Sonderkommando had a far higher chance of survival, at least for a few months, because every 3 months the Sonderkommando unit would be rotated out, which meant being sent to the gas chambers themselves. A new squad would be brought in from incoming prisoners, and their first duty was often to dispose of the bodies of their predecessors. Only a few survived the war, and making it to a year was exceedingly rare. And that led to some acts of desperation. Two of the most famous revolts against the Nazi death camp machine were orchestrated by Sonderkommando. At Treblinka, over 700 managed to fight back, with 100 surviving and escaping. While at Auschwitz, a group of Sonderkommandos were warned that their time was up by the camp resistance and waged a violent revolt. While some escaped, the majority were quickly recaptured and executed. For the small number who survived, this horrific duty left some of the worst mental scars from one of history's darkest periods. Want to know more about the weapons of World War II? Check out Most Terrifying Weapons of World War II or click on this video instead.